Hello, 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 all. I see people running in. I'm so excited to see everyone. If you have not been here before, welcome to the Inkwell Exchange. And here is our guest. Okay, if you're new here, this is probably the smoothest this has ever run, so I'm very excited. Okay, but let me do my intro and then I will pass it to our guests to introduce themselves. Hi, welcome to the Inkwell Exchange. If you're new here, this is a platform that I've been building up to allow authors, writers, poets, speakers, anybody who works with words to talk about their content, their art, their books. And today we have another amazing artist that I was lucky enough to get through Instagram to come and speak to us about his work, his writing journey. And so I'm going to pass it to him to introduce himself, and then we will dive into all of the questions. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. My name is Johnny Compton. I'm the author of a haunted house story titled The Spite House. It's my debut novel, came out in February of this year. And next year, in March, the paperback edition, it came out as a hardcover. Paperback edition will be out next year for anybody who wants a maybe more affordable option to read it. Or, of course, you can always support your local library if you can't actually pick up a copy to purchase. Totally happy with you supporting your library. Either way, that's who I am, kind of in a nutshell, as an author, at least as it currently exists. I used to write short stories. I still do, I guess, but that's where I got my start. And now I'm a relatively new, or still pretty new, novelist.
I think that's an excellent place to start. So I always ask people how they started. You kind of hit the nail on the head. You started with short stories. I also love writing short stories and reading short stories. We may dive into like what are some of your favorites later. But how did you make the transition from long, like short form to long form? I feel like that as somebody who's tried in the past and completely failed, how did you kind of get your mindset to do that?
It was difficult. A lot of it was just sticking to it, which is pretty cliche to say, but is also just the truth. But I had a lot of failed attempts prior to that. I've been trying to write a novel for I since sometime in the mid aughts or so, or even early aughts, I guess. And a lot of them I would just get started and then lose confidence in the book about halfway through or a quarter of the way through or however far I was into writing it and start over. And so this time I took some inspiration. I'd gone on a visit to my brother up north in the DC area, went to the African American History Museum, and there's a great entire floor dedicated to um, entertainment and arts, and kind of realized that I was getting in my own way, and other people have preceded me who overcame a lot worse than just their own self doubt. So I owed it to myself and to my predecessors to just try it, commit to it, finish the book, no matter what the self doubts are. Like you say, with short stories, it's a lot different. You're at the finish line a lot sooner, obviously. And so just the idea of trying to sustain this narrative throughout however many pages, however many words, your sustained word count, an
Yeah.
entirely different animal. And so just maintaining that confidence to say, well, if it's bad, I'm going to let somebody else tell me it's bad and not be self-defeating. That was the biggest hurdle for me when it came from transitioning from short stories to a full-length novel.
Do you think the type of story you used to write as a short form made a difference when you transitioned? So for instance, I say that because coming from a place of like I get bored. Like if I go from my short story and be like, "Oh yeah, let me try and see if I can write like a longer form one." I think what happens is I get bored, which means I tell myself then the reader will also be bored. And then I am at that point like, but I could wrap this story so neatly with so fewer words and it be gorgeous. And I think that is one of the things that definitely gets in my way. Like as a writer, I'm done. It's like I'm finished, I'm bored, on to the next story.
There is I get, I'm not going to quite say bored, but I do get a little bit anxious to start a new idea. I'm flooded with ideas. And
Yeah.
so there is a level of discipline to, okay, this is the idea I'm on. Don't immediately just a new idea is the new shiny toy, right? I just had this other thing pop in my head, and so I've developed ways of just getting a little bit of that out of my system. I have a spreadsheet with new ideas that is currently 20 books deep, and short stories. I think my short stories that I haven't quite written, it's like 50, but I have it. I put in a synopsis, and I kind of go back to it, and then I have Microsoft OneNote pages for a lot of them, where if I think of something for a character, for the new idea that I can't work on yet, but I can go in there, I can exercise some of that, get it out of my system, put in what I think about the character, a plot point, a piece of dialogue, a piece of narration, something,
Yeah.
and do it, and then be able to go back to what it is that I'm supposed to be focusing on. And that's for me how it's similar to what you talked about, and that is a challenge for me, wanting to jump to the next thing. And with short stories, you get that gratification a lot sooner. So finding out ways to combat that, knowing that about myself, it's been pretty instrumental to me, I think, learning how to keep going now that I'm trying to build a career as a novelist.
Right. And so I think that's also a fun transition into how did you settle on doing a novel like in the horror genre? Have you always written in mystery or horror? Or is that a new fun toy to play with?
No. This is horror is my bag. I'm going to give a little tour slide of like some of the art.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So this is my thing. And I've always loved horror. I love other genres as well. I was just or posting about one of my favorite books that I read this year is a drama set in the South, a period drama written by Jamila Minix, Moonrise Over New Jessup, which I think is a fantastic book. So I read outside of horror a lot because I think that helps to inform certain important pieces of writing that can bolster your efforts if you're expanding beyond just horror and just thinking of how to write the next scary scene or sequence. There are excellent horror novels, obviously, that'll give you those pointers as well. But reading beyond it helps to refocus you on, if I needed to write an entire story that's just character focused or focused on just love and family and relationships, can you do that? Can you sustain that? And that's one of the things I wanted to try to be able to do with my book, The Spite House, even though it is very much a horror novel and there are plenty of ghosts and a lot of horrible things that happen. But I also feel like it's centered around a family drama and history and explorations of guilt and secrets and all these human elements. And I think that being able to bring that in and center it and ground it a little bit, hopefully helps people connect with it a little bit better and almost lull you into forgetting at certain points that you're even reading a ghost story right at the time when I can then spring a bunch of ghosts on you and surprise the hell out of you and hopefully scare the hell out of you. But horror has always been that's always been my bag. It's my favorite genre by far. Absolutely love it.
So as a reader, what is the thing that you always read about in a horror book but have either struggled to like make real in one of your stories, or like have always wanted to include but haven't? So I'll start because I definitely have one. I love unreliable narrators. Like, I think that is the best way to sustain tension in a book, because I think otherwise, most of the time as a reader, you just have too much access to stuff that if you're a narrator, you can't trust what they say, then you can't trust anything, right? And so there's a balance, of course, between like losing the reader and all of that stuff. But I think doing that well is one of the best things that I've always tried to like replicate in my own writing. I've done it semi-successfully sometimes, but like that, I want to master the art of the unreliable narrator. What about you?
Man, that is a fascinating question. I love it. This is something that's been on my mind very, very recently because I was contacted about maybe submitting something for an effort, and I realized I've never done this, even though I absolutely love sci-fi horror. But I've never written. I have like one or two ideas out of my huge list of ideas, and for whatever reason, and I'm terrified of even maybe trying it, even though just going back to even like I've read the book of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I love the movie. And one of my favorite movies is Alien. And I just read The Scourge Between the Stars. and I really love that. And there are so many different sci-fi horror novels going back to obviously Frankenstein, even, which the book I think is actually incredible and fascinating. And yet, for all my love of science fiction horror and the idea of an alien creature or a mad scientist doing something and unleashing something on humanity that they should not, as much as I love the genre itself, reading it or watching it, I've never even come close, I think, to really attempting a sci-fi horror story. And so I am eager to at some point try it, and yet at the same time, I'm slightly intimidated by it. I'm not going to lie, just because it's something, for whatever reason, I feel like there has to be something in the back of my mind that is blocking me from even attempting it, considering how much I enjoy the genre, for me to have never, out of everything I've written, to have never really gone down that avenue. Maybe
Yeah, no,
there's
I
something in me
completely.
that's telling me that that's not my thing.
Well, I mean, sometimes you have to like work at things. I think one of the things, because I think mystery, maybe detective fiction, but like my gateway into the drug that I call reading, was definitely Edgar Allan Poe, which is like
Mhm.
basic foundational horror. And I did more of his detective fiction, like short stories first, before I stumbled into his more gruesome stuff. But I think there is something like amazingly beautiful in horror too that I think sometimes people get lost or like lose because they're like, oh yeah, it's just scary and like whatever. But there's always like these elements, kind of like you talked about, right? There's either a family element or a reconciliation element that usually is somehow explained or expanded upon in horror. How do you kind of make that balance when you're writing horror stories, like the emotion, but also like the thrill that people are coming to seek?
I try to. I mean, I think it's really important to try as well as you can to blend both, and I think that my biggest objective is to maturely, I will say, my biggest objective is to write a fantastic story. The immature side of me, I want to scare the hell out of people. I
Right.
want to give you nightmares. Like I just read somebody. I try not to read reviews or anything because reviews are not for writers; they're for other readers, and it's not really our domain. But something came to me that somebody had mentioned, and it's not the first time. They said that my book actually gave them nightmares, and every time I read that, that is like my biggest charge out of anything else I can get. So
Yeah.
having said that, and knowing that that's kind of I'm calling it immature, probably a better word for it. I don't mean it insultingly, but whatever side of me wants to just do that, I know that I have to balance it out with other things. But I think the things that have scared me the most, um, generally speaking, have also incorporated a lot of these other elements. So I know that it's actually serving the purpose that I want if I can make it a little bit more emotional and get you invested and get you to realize the sadness of somebody maybe suffering through whatever it is that I'm putting them through, the difficulty of it, the attempt to overcome it, etc. One of my favorite books, horror novels of all time, is Pet Sematary, which is just really, I mean, an emotionally brutal story, obviously, just based on the subject matter. And getting you to invest in that element of it is what enhances the completeness of the horror. It's not just basically a zombies rising from the grave narrative. It is something so much more, specifically because it incorporates so many of these important, relatable, emotional elements. So remembering that, always keeping it in mind, and then using examples that I find from other books, like I mentioned earlier with Moonrise over New Jessup, for example. Um, Remembering all these other great examples that I've picked up on, and trying to remember to always incorporate that, is just really how I maintain that balance. It's not really a specific technique or anything. It's just always a remembrance that's in there.
Speaking of inspiration outside of like books, how do you use the real world is scary? Like I've been forced into the world of adulting, so I do understand. Like even my laundry basket can kind of get scary occasionally. But how do you use the real world to inform, your inspiration when it comes to writing horror or mystery?
I think it's really important. That's a great question. I think it's really important to remember those things. It's like you said, you get into adulting now. It's one of the things I learned when I was much younger. We always grow up watching horror movies, reading horror stories, a haunted house story. Why don't they just leave the house? then like you get a mortgage, and it's like, I don't know, man. Like, is a foreclosure or a ghost scarier? Because, like, if I have to move my kids to the bad side of town, is that scarier than? It depends on what this ghost is doing. If it's just like footsteps in the night, we can live with that. You gotta start throwing stuff around or something before I'm ready to mess up my credit. and, you know, so I think those kind of real world fears, it to me, even from something as mundane or comparatively mundane as that, it's not a giant a demon or something crawling out of hell, but it
Yeah.
can be these regular kind of ordinary fears that are still in play in mind. And I take a lot of inspiration, especially from something as relatively ordinary as that, and compound that and use that to um, contrast it with the more spectacular fears that are inevitably going to then pop up in my story. The second book I'm working on, I try to. I mean, it's got a lot of um, extreme supernatural elements to it, but I also try to just bring it back home to there's a story about grieving and navigating the real world loss of someone, but just within the context of something extreme and extraordinary and impossible, but trying to keep it grounded and founded within a place that everybody can relate to in certain elements of, I might not ever go through what this person is going through specifically in terms of being, basically stalked by, uh, preternatural beings, but I can relate to maybe how would I feel if I suffered a certain loss, if I witnessed a certain thing. Trying to keep it vague here because I don't want to spoil my,
Yeah,
my next book.
I think there's also, I think kind of along that same line, I was thinking about like other movies, for instance, that have had characters that were slowly driven absolutely mad by like super small things, like such like a book not being where you left it, a knife all of a sudden going missing, right? And how as authors we can play with subtle stuff like that in a really fun way, because you can just drop a sentence and it's like slowly but surely it's building and you're like, wait. And then you as the reader have to think, are they going crazy or am I going crazy or are we going crazy collectively? And I like that's the feel that you can always drip in that leads up and makes that like that big moment of like, absolutely, I'm throwing this book across the room. I can't believe that just happened. Right? Feel earned.
Absolutely, yeah. It's one of the things I look forward to trying to do in writing, especially you talked earlier about the difference between short stories and longer fiction. One of the fun elements of longer fiction is that you can kind of plant those seeds, a lot more of them throughout, and lead up to a big moment, a big frightening moment, and when you get to kind of layer it with these subtle clues and these hints, and like you said, make people think, wait a minute, I thought they said this earlier, and realize this is not a mistake. This is like something bad and something crazy is happening here. And being able to do that with, I mean, you can do that with other mediums, but being able to hide it as well as we can hide it, I mean, literally, if you wanted to, like you said, just put a sentence in a block of a paragraph, you can do that. And I remember, I mean, I'm just trying to think of examples off the top, and one of the ones, it's cliche to keep going back to Stephen King, but he has a book called Desperation, and in Desperation, there's a moment where there's a demon. This is not a spoiler. There's a demon that is possessing and this is early in the book. A demon has possessed the sheriff of a small town, and he's basically collecting people to do horrible things to them. And he's reading the rights to a bunch of people, to a couple that is in the back seat of his car, and he sneaks in the words, "I'm going to kill you," but it's in this huge paragraph. And the first time I read it, it's such a block of text. I missed that line, and then you get to the couple reacting to it, and they're like, "Did he say what I think he just said?" And then I was like, "Well, what are they even talking about?" So then I went back and reread it, and I was like, "Oh my God, he just said this, and he snuck it in here." And like just being able to play with the reader like that and make them go back and say, "Oh, I missed that," and imagining like if you had heard something like that in real life, would I have even picked up on that? And now I'm sharing some of their emotion of like, is did he just say what I think he said? Did I missed reading that? Oh my gosh, that is there. Am I reading that correctly? You can do that kind of thing, and it's being able to have fun with how you want to incorporate that into the text is part of the joy of writing, I think.
Yeah, no, Stephen King's a master for a reason. I think, but I think one of the things that makes him the master is he uses readers. He's a reader, so he
Yeah.
uses readers' habits against them, right? And
Yep.
if you're a reader like you and I, and you just like consume books like you, I have definitely skipped Hope like that. I got it. Like I don't need you to describe the dresser for me, but like those are great places if you're being intentional to hide really important clues because we're not going to pick it up ASAP Rocky. You're going to pick it up later and be like, oh, yeah, I probably could have guessed the ending if I had been actually paying attention. And I think it feels a little more earned again when you feel like, oh no, this didn't come out of nowhere. Like I just as careless, just like the careless people in the story, just kind of walked right over it and was like, oh no, it's fine. Right? Like Jean has been missing for 2 weeks and you told me that at the beginning of the story and nobody has been looking for Jean. Like I should probably think about that a little harder than I have been, you know? So things
Yeah.
like that are always fun to play with readers about.
Definitely. Gosh, I don't want to spoil anything, even though this is a very old movie. So I'm not going to name the movie. I'm going to keep this very vague. But there's a movie that opens with a line that it opens with the line, "Let me tell you about the time I almost died," and that is very important. And then it closes with that line in a very different context at the end, and reminds you, "I said this at the beginning, and you probably forgot by now." And once you get to that moment, and some people might, it's one of those things like I kind of can't spoil it now because if you know what that line is from, then you know what movie I'm talking about already. You've already seen it, hopefully. Um, but it's such a great moment, and it also kind of depends on do you who the reader is or who the watcher is, whatever it is, what your audience is. Do they actually enjoy being fooled or not? Some people actually don't enjoy being fooled. Some
Yeah.
people feel like I want to have everything laid out for me. I want to be able to guess this. I want it to kind of be a little bit obvious. More power to you. Read what you like to read, and however you want to read. I'm one of those people. If you fool me, I'm really happy with it. I'm
Yeah.
like thrilled. I'm like, oh man, they got me. They really got it. I feel charged up when something like that happens. So, yeah, knowing that you can do that sort of thing, I'm always excited about opportunities to do that when I'm writing.
Yeah, I think the best way that authors have ever gotten to me, I'll like swing back to when I was in college, like my graduate school. The one class I took that I think I learned the most about writing in actually was a screenplay, where we took a book and turned it into like learned how to turn it into a screenplay. That and it was a horror book that we did. And I
Hmm.
think that was my best lesson in show don't tell, because
Yeah.
so much of books, like even as readers, we always talk about how terrible people like convert books to movies and like the occasional good one. But like there is so much you can condense in books to if you show the reader and don't tell them. And so I think all of the best books that I have on like my top 100 list, because don't ask me my favorite books, it's very concerning. Um, but are all books where the author has taken the time to not tell me, but to show me, whether it be through how the character is speaking, the character's actions that seem kind of odd. That's like, oh, why are they doing this and this, but you're not going to tell me, right? Things like that are always very useful kind of techniques and plugs. And I didn't even really think about them until I was kind of forced to, because like I don't have 5 hours to give you this book word for word. So I've got to figure out what are the important things and how can I sometimes even creating the most interesting thing was creating like taking whole characters and making them plugins for like devices that happen in books.
Yeah.
And I never really thought that through. So, and I think particularly in horror and mystery, that's where you can do it. Because otherwise, you don't need those devices quite as much in like a drama or a romance or things like that.
Right.
So,
No, you get a lot of opportunity in horror to make people archetypes of what you need in a certain moment, and you kind of get a chance to do that. You want to not fully, you want them to still be fully fleshed out characters, but also they represent something. There's a lot of, I mean, other genres do this too, but in other types of writing, but there are a lot of this person is a metaphor. This entire person basically is a metaphor for greed or obsession or, you know, something. And you're exploring that in depth in this story, and then you unleash, you know,
Right.
the
Right.
of hell or whatever on them.
Well, I'm going to take a slight pivot because I do want to talk a little bit about the business of being an author. I just got asked to do like a workshop on it too, which was crazy. But like, let's talk about like, okay, so the book is done. You're finished. You've written your book, right? Like, how did your journey to publishing look, and what did you kind of learn from it?
Man, it was pretty straightforward for me. I submitted to a bunch of different agents. I used a website that gave me a list of agents that are looking for specific genres. I found the ones that are looking for horror, went in alphabetical order, and just started going to their websites. Make sure you're always paying attention to every single email you send out, because I made a couple of mistakes early on where I forgot to change certain components, and it becomes very clear that you're sending out like kind of a generic one, and that'll get you rejected very quickly. And so then went through, eventually found a few people that requested more follow-up. So you go through that process, you submit, you know, the additional documents, whatever it is that they're requesting, whether it's additional chapters, the full manuscript, what have you. Found an agent that wanted to represent me, kept working on the book from there, get some additional pre-editing done before we submitted it to publishers. He laid out exactly these are the people we're going to submit to. This is the timeline. Went through that process, found a publisher, and took off from there. The thing I learned is and this is very difficult when you're starting out, but ask every question. It's one of those things where people tell you there's no such thing as a stupid question. And, you know, we all know that there are some stupid questions. But this is an environment, if you're brand new to something like this, absolutely ask every question. Don't treat it like let somebody else tell you it's a stupid question. Don't tell yourself it's a stupid question before you ask. Because you always have the fallback of, I literally have never done this before, and this is a very unusual environment. This is not like any other job you've ever attempted to get into. This is not like any job interview you've ever had. And you literally are kind of going through a sort of, for me at least, I went through like kind of a job interview process with certain editors, and you're meeting with them, talking with the editors. They want to know about what other book projects you might have in the future, if we're looking to offer you a multi-book deal. How open are you to certain amounts of feedback? And you've never done, I'd never done anything close to this before. And so there were a lot of questions that I didn't ask early on, and I was still very fortunate in the process that none of that really came back to bite me, per se, in you know, ultimately where I ended up landing. But if I had to do it over again, I would ask every single one of the questions that came to mind that I thought at the time, well, I probably shouldn't ask this. It's probably stupid. It'll work itself out. Trust in everybody. And everybody was trustworthy still, but it's still worth it to ask the questions. That to me is the biggest, from a business perspective, lesson I have. Speaking up, that's the biggest, you know, transition I've had from debuting to looking for my second, third, you know, the next stages of my potential career here. Speaking up, asking questions, and not kind of waiting for things to happen and presuming things will kind of be sorted out. Making sure that you're vocalizing whatever it is that's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think authors forget how entrepreneurial this part of the business is. Because I self-published. I have a children's book called Me Cairo. It's lovely. About my puppy. She's somewhere. And I think one of the things, like, I learned, if you've been here, you probably have heard this before, but if not, I really wish I didn't have as much experience in publishing as I wanted to or could have had. And I had people help me, which is great. But I still wish, as far as contracts go, things like that, it would have been great to have somebody who was there to be like, hey, like, this is more of a price point. These are the people's actual, like, ambitions, and this is the reason why they may want you to hike your price point up. This is why, like, things like that, and a higher price point makes it a little harder to sell a book because most people aren't looking to spend, you know, $50 on a book, right? There are the occasional. I've done that a couple of special editions, but I think, but most people are not in that space, right? So, like, things like that I wish I had known how important marketing is, how it's a really like a time trade-off, right? So I always say, like, if you aren't going to have time to market your book, I would suggest not self-publishing, right? It's not a good plan. If you have tons of time to market your book, I'm in PR. I don't do as much marketing of my book as I can, but I do have the skill set. And books are somewhat evergreen depending on the type of book you have, right? So there is the opportunity for you to do that as well. But I just think if marketing is like foreign to you, you have no desire to be in front of a camera, you have no desire to like talk to people, create audiences, maybe self-publishing is not for you. That's where the publisher is really, really helpful because they have marketers and publicists and all of that stuff. They can do those things for you.
Yes, 100%. And a lot of it is a lot of getting into it from that perspective is knowing yourself. What are you good at? What are you comfortable with? And then pursuing the proper path accordingly. So self-publishing, absolutely total valid path. But like you mentioned, a lot of people get into it without realizing, do I have it in myself, or do I know people? Do I have the resources that I can leverage? So if I can write a book, but maybe I'm not great with covers. Do I have the means, the money to hire a good cover artist? Or do I know somebody who is, a really good artist who might be able to help me with this and leverage that and, do, something for them that in exchange, whether it's, you're compensating them, with money or whatever it is, if you know them and you have that relationship, whatever it is, but do you have a plan in place for your editing? Because you're going to have to hire your own editor if you're self-publishing. I self-published a short story collection years and years and years and years ago. So I'm aware of that, and I did my own marketing, but I'm not super, and this was a little pre-social media, but I'm not super into social media as it is in terms of like the way you're able to get out and speak to people and things like that. So I've realized that failing in myself, and I thought this is going to be a hindrance, but I tried to create my own ads and find places for the ads to go, and that didn't go as well. And then I, eventually realized this is not the path for me. Other people find success doing this because they have the skill sets, they're equipped to do this better, or they're willing to learn these things and become comfortable with these things if this is truly what they want to pursue. And none of that, just none of it applied to me at the moment. So I opted for a different route. But you're right, just knowing that, and then again, kind of tying it back to just don't be afraid to ask questions. Sometimes you got to ask those questions of yourself first and foremost. Like, am I willing to do this? Am I capable of doing this? Am I good at this? If I'm not good at it, can I learn? Do I know how to learn? Do I know where to go to acquire this information? And line all of that up first. Don't get the cart before the horse, as they say. Line all of that up first before you really start getting too far down the path that might not be the right path for you.
Agreed. Because I always say, like, there are dollar signs behind a lot of this, right? Like, so if you see somebody with really nice graphics or really not, like, at the very least, they probably have a Canva subscription or Adobe subscription, right? Like, and those are actual dollar signs. If you don't just have a place that you're kind of like piggyback off of to get it, right? Things like that, I think, are really important to think of because you won't necessarily, but you're probably going to lose some money in the game because it's a learning lesson, just like any other business, right? And so I think those are like really great words of advice to leave people with. So I'm going to wrap with my favorite question and my final question, which is, how can we as an audience support you and find you and keep up with you?
I'm all social media that I do use, which again, I'm not super present, but I am mostly present on Instagram, if anywhere. At Compton Writes. Compton, my last name. You guys probably see it you can find it in the listing here. Compton Writes. My website, johnnycompton.com. You can find all my information there as well. And then, like I said at the top, by all means, if you have it in your budget, buy the book. Hardcover's out right now. If you want to wait for the paperback, happy to receive that support as well. That comes out in March. And if none of that works for you, by all means, check it out at a library. Libraries are very important to us. Helps out authors. It actually does. Support your local library, by all means.
Definitely. I love that so much. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank everyone who came through, who viewed, who's going to rewatch. It's fine. It's live. You can always rewatch it. And we'll have clips and stuff that go out. If you follow me on Instagram, it's always a great place to come. I will, of course, tag Johnny, so you will be able to see his @ and all of that great information. Follow over to his page and hit the follow button. We're authors, writers, all of us wordsmiths really appreciate that kind of support. We're artists and creatives just like everybody else. Sometimes we're not as sensitive about our shit like Erica Badu, but it's there. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining me. And keep an eye out for the next Inkwell Exchange. So
Thank
long.
you.
Bye.